Hey everyone, it's Last Protagonist. I wanted to make a video today talking about some quality of life features I'd like to see implemented into Path of Exile 2, and I went ahead and made this into a pseudo bingo card style format because I know how much Mark enjoys that kind of thing. So anyway, starting off first, one of the things that I find to be really tedious is that the recombinator cannot mass recombine items, and one of the easier ways to look at that is if you're trying to 3-to-1 delirium emotions and get the higher tiers. It's really annoying having to click 3 times for each individual emotion, click to recombine, and then click to loot your new item, and then repeat that process over and over. That could just be expedited and be made so much better. Another thing is that map crafting, I find that to be really tedious in its current format. So corrupting for T16s feels tedious. I don't even know the ratio. It feels like maybe 1 to 10 Val Orbs you'll use. You'll get a upgrade to make a T15 into a T16. That doesn't feel good to me, but I mean, it's a pretty minor complaint. But anyway, another painful point of actually map crafting is putting on all the modifiers onto your items. So needing to use a bis vertebrae so that way you can craft your desecrated mod, using omens to adjust what you get on your map is tedious, and it'd be nice if you could all do that from one centralized location without having to go through multiple loading screens or animations to just make the endgame flow a little bit more smoothly. So, tying into that, for me, Ritual and Expedition are really annoying and tedious to go through the act of actually playing through them, because the monsters spawn in waves a little bit slowly, and some monsters are really difficult to find if they're straggling and burrowing into the ground or something like that. It'd be nice if Ritual wouldn't spawn in the worms that get stuck in the ground and they're hard to tell where they are. And it'd be nice that if there's only 1 or 2 enemies left in a Ritual or Expedition, that it would clean it up after you don't find anything for like 5 or 10 seconds. Because it's really annoying just wasting the time trying to find something when the visibility isn't the best in some of these maps to begin with, especially if you have delirium going on. Another painful point would be that with the addition of the higher tiers of currency for crafting, dismantling and disenchanting things feels completely unrewarding in the endgame, especially as you start to juice your maps, because Regal Orbs just get outscaled with the tiered Regal Orbs, like the perfect ones. So what incentive do I have to dismantle or disenchant something which is going to give me a Regal Orb? In the endgame, it almost feels better to just sell everything for gold, unless you're going to sell it on the marketplace directly. So it'd be cool if we could start getting either greater Regal Orb shards or perfect ones. And it also kind of sucks having to choose between dismantling and disenchanting, whether or not you want Artificer Orbs or Blacksmith Whetstones and whatnot versus Regal Orbs, which you don't really want anymore. So maybe this isn't as much of a problem anymore. So another huge quality of life upgrade would be allowing there to be uncut runes for basic tiers of runes. Because if you're ever going through a game playing solo self-found or something like that, I've seen runs where people don't get 2 iron runes until they've reached level 94. And if the purpose of runes is to kind of fix your defenses, the amount in which they drop is just all over the place, and you're not really getting the types of runes to fix your gear yourself. So I think this could all be fixed, and we already do have that blink rune that we can get from Renly in Act 1. So if they just made that a more robust thing, I think players would enjoy interacting with that system a lot more. So this is a pretty big one. In the endgame, as you start to juice your content and get a lot more loot from your maps, you may run into the problem, if you're not running a loot filter, that you can no longer even see the enemies because they're just covered by the nameplates of items. So you either need GGG to drop less loot in the game, but maybe better loot in the process, or they need to bite the bullet and allow players to have a built-in loot filter, so that way they can stop the garbage from showing up on their screen, because there's no way a new player is going to know about loot filters to begin with. And once they get to the end game, they might be frustrated at the lack of transparency. So that'll tie directly into the next point with having more transparency options in the options or something like that. Whether it be on the skills themselves or on the nameplates for items, that'd be pretty nice to have. So that way, if I can either make it so that monsters appear on top of the items and the items are like behind the monsters, so that way they don't get covered, or their skills. That'd be nice. It'd also be nice if I could literally adjust the transparency with a slider, so that way I can make items like 60% transparent, so that way I can still see the monsters behind the items if they want to keep things that way as it is. This is a personal grievance, but does Expedition really need 4 currencies? I know Expedition is in a bit of a lackluster state and they could iterate on this further, but it just feels tedious that we have 4 different vendors, which are kind of all ignored right now. And I think mostly the reason people even run Expedition anymore is, you know, for logbooks or the Recombinator, which doesn't really tie into the vendors themselves. Another thing that it'd be nice to have in the game, and I know they said that they wanted to put this in, but it wasn't in this patch, even though it sounded like Jonathan said it would be, is that you can't hover over enemy buffs and debuffs while you have the game pause, so that makes it a little bit difficult to tell what certain modifiers do. So this gets really important when you're a new player and you're trying to figure out what the hell is going on in the abyssal mechanic, and then you have an enemy that has Shadewalker and then they just teleport on top of you. How are you supposed to know you can't heal? You can't pause the game to see what's going on, and the monsters are mobbing you so fast, you don't really have the time to figure it out on the fly, so that's why the pause option would be quite impactful in my opinion. And that'll tie into buffs and debuffs and icon UI improvements in general. There are some icons that I have no idea what the hell they're supposed to represent, and I can't really type into Google, hey, what is this squiggly line icon in Path of Exile 2? And if you try to like look something up on PoE2DB to just figure out what the icons are, it's a mess. So I think these two will go hand in hand. It'd also be nice if we just had some UI improvements in general, which will keep better track of things like your cooldowns, because tracking your CDs is a little bit rough right now. And moving on from there, let's talk about minions briefly. Minion move speed is pretty atrocious, and I think it should scale with the player, especially if you're trying to use something like companions and you're on the bottom right side of the tree and you're picking up these movement skill nodes. Your companions can't keep up with you unless you have a specifically fast companion or one that's implicitly hasted or has the haste aura. It's just such a mess trying to make those work, and taming beasts in general is also awful, so both of these, I think, should have some quality of life fixes. Maybe if we get Einhar or something and can start like taming and breeding beasts to get the mods that we want on them, that can make things better. As it is now, it's just a pretty painful part of the game, which Jonathan, I believe, has recognized in an interview as well. So this I made is kind of pseudo free spot until I started adding more than the 25 bingo nodes, whatever. Performance upgrades, that should just kind of go without speaking. This is the free square. And another thing which would be nice as a quality of life feature would be having abilities which can cancel out other ground effects. So if Consecrated Ground could overwrite such things as Burning Ground or Chilled Ground, I think that would give melee users a lot more incentive to run things like Consecrated Ground, and that would also help alleviate some of their concerns about getting on top of bosses when there's too much degened ground around them. Another thing which ties into the ground thematic here is that there's a lot of ground clutter in some maps, and that can block some skills in unintended ways. It's a little bit annoying going around some trees and rocks in different locations, so they could look at that and improve that. Another thing is that we could definitely use a dedicated sprint button rather than having to go into it from a dodge roll. I'm pretty sure GGG has gotten this feedback ad nauseum, but of course, it is worth reiterating because I feel the same way. And tying into that, it'd also be nice if we had a dedicated Mirage Archer button for the same reason. It feels really bad to accidentally activate the Mirage Archer if you're just trying to sprint, and it doesn't feel good. Another huge quality of life improvement, I think, for newer players would be if campaign bosses stopped getting their loot nerfed after you've killed them for the first time, and allowed players to gain the same amount of loot for each time they defeated them. So that way, if they ran into a wall boss like Geonor, but they couldn't beat Geonor, they could go back and farm a different boss to gain some more loot to give them better items for a better chance at beating Geonor, for instance. So if that becomes too valuable, I think this would highlight another potential issue that item levels don't seem to be important enough for progression if currency is that valuable. But I think it'll fix itself now that we have like the tiered currencies, because exalted orbs aren't really that important and they won't really matter too much in the campaign. So another quality of life feature that I'd like to see would be shortening the trials of Sekima and Chaos. And I mean specifically the third and fourth tiers, because the first two feel kind of fine if they respect the player's time, relatively speaking. They're not terribly long, not terribly short. I think they're a really good place right now. But once you're trying to go through floor 3 and floor 4 of Sekima, and your build is able to dumpsters floors 1 and 2 or even 3 consistently, it just feels like a huge time sink for not as much reward as I would like myself. Maybe the people who actually run Sekimas feel differently. Chaos has that issue where you need to complete 3 trials of Chaos to get the 4th Ascendancy. That just feels a little bit awkward to me. Anyway, one other thing that might be worth considering is having higher eye level items drop through different Jin Barrias and ultimatums. Because we can go up to what, like 79, 80, but we can't really get level 81 or 82 items. Maybe there's an intent behind that, but it does make farming these two things feel a little bit less enticing than they otherwise could be when the higher base level items are king in the end game. As far as the campaign is concerned, if you're going through it on another character, or if you're revisiting a location on a character that's already cleared a point, it can feel really awkward trying to port back into some of these zones or locations, because the waypoints aren't in the maps themselves, so you have to go teleport to a waypoint to be in the boat that you need to climb out of to go into the map. Yeah, that could be better, especially if you're trying to farm a location to tame a beast, for instance. That is less than ideal. So moving on from there, it would always be nice to have more stash tab types, and I'm sure GGG is working on it, but right now trying to store all your breach catalysts is really annoying. We could certainly use an abyss page as well. And then the Atlas has a lot of problems I don't want to get too deeply into, but one quality of life feature which would definitely help things would be having a search bar, kind of like with the passive tree. But of course the Atlas is probably a bit more problematic because it's procedurally generated. But I do have some concerns about the Atlas in general, because your reward for clearing the Atlas is making it so that you always have to scroll farther and farther the more you progress. So I think it might be in the long term a better idea to kind of scrap the Atlas system entirely, even though I actually do kind of enjoy the idea of it. I just don't really see this being truly viable for the long term, unfortunately. So one thing that we can take for granted is trade optimizations, but it's worth repeating here that it'd be nice to have a search history and things like that. I'm sure this will be looked at over time as well. Another huge quality of life improvement would be having a more pronounced weapon set UI, so that way players who are new to the game understand that they can use their weapon set points with different weapons and their passive tree, because it's a little bit hidden right now, especially if you're trying to lock one skill per weapon set. Maybe you should have like weapon set 1 tab at the top of the skill tree and then weapon set 2. That might help, I don't know. This is almost another freebie. We've known Jonathan's been talking about this since before the game came out into early access, that the combined mouse and keyboard and controller support is something that players have been wanting, so I figured it's worth reiterating here as well. Another quality of life feature that I would like would be having it so that mapping completion can be done with either killing rares or bosses. Now, part of the reason why I would like this is that this could potentially enable some builds to focus on clearing maps for the rare monsters or essences or things like that. Oh yeah, I should also say, instead of just rares or bosses, or like extra content would be pretty good. One of the issues now that we've lost the icons for rare monsters on maps is that it's really hard to differentiate some rare monsters from non-rare monsters unless they have an aura effect, such as like haste, or temporal bubble is probably an easier one to see. And This also ties back into taming monsters, and it really sucks to kill a rare before you even really see that it's a rare to know if it's got a set of mods that you'd want on it. But I know GGG doesn't want to just put on the tacky blue or golden aura that was in Path of Exile 1, which I understand, but it's a little bit difficult knowing the threat level of certain monsters anymore. And maybe they just need to make rare monsters more visually distinct, or magic monsters as well. So anyway, this one, I don't think it'll pretty much ever get solved because it's a huge legacy holdover from Path of Exile 1, in that I would like there to be a bit of a stat overhaul in terms of making local and global stats distinct and easily identifiable on items. So for instance, having the elemental resistances on things being a global stat is fine, and that makes a lot of sense. But when I was first playing Path of Exile 1, when I saw that I had a body armor with like 100% increased armor, I thought that was affecting my entire character and all of my armor rating. But there's no visual distinction between that on the body armor versus what you'd get on an amulet, to know that the amulet affects your entire character for like 30% extra armor versus just the actual stats of the armor itself. So there was a lot of times where I would have armors that had like a low base value of armor on it. So if it had a huge increased percent, it really didn't matter because I didn't have the flat stats to make it better. And that was just pretty unintuitive to me. Another thing would be that maybe it'd be better if instead of having so many percentage-based increases, we had more flat values. So that way it was a little bit more easily manageable in terms of balancing things. Because I think one of the issues that has like the top end builds vastly outscaling the mid performers even is just the amount of multipliers that we have on both our gear and passives and things like that. And then another stat overhaul, which I think is really important, especially with the advent of the Abyssal League, is that we need some kind of compendium to describe things like what the hell a Kurgal modifier is and things like that. And this will definitely take the most work, so I don't really think this will be implemented anytime soon, if at all. So anyway, those are some of the quality of life fixes that I'd like to see in the game. Maybe you guys in the comments will have more to add yourselves. I would definitely be interested in seeing them. And so I'll go ahead and copy this and make it its own image, so that way if we want to send it to GGG for some feedback, that way we would be able to do so. So anyway, thank you all for watching until the end. I appreciate it. I also want to shout out my patrons and channel members for continuing to support me as I take lots of time to make other content like this. So thank you once again for watching. Hopefully I'll catch you all on the next one. Until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.